Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, students, bonjour tout le monde. Merci d'être là. Alors, c'est la 4e journée de Science Week 2025, de la 5e édition de Science Week, 5th edition of Science Week. Les 3 premières journées ont été, de l'avis de tout le monde, un succès. Alors, le Collège d'agriculture m'a promis que ce serait encore plus extraordinaire aujourd'hui. On va voir, on a un programme extrêmement intéressant. J'appelle tout de suite le MC de la matinée, qui est Manal Mheda, qui est assistant professeur au Collège d'agriculture. Alors Manal, on a eu une discussion avec les professeurs. Il y en a qui voulaient que je t'annonce comme le rising star et d'autres comme le shooting star. So is she a rising star or a shooting star? Philosophical discussion. Manal.
Thank you, Professor Fouad. I'm so happy to be here. So every time is more challenging than the previous time. I'm so glad to be among you. Ladies and gentlemen, you are welcome to the 4th day of the Science Week. And this day is dedicated for agriculture. And I want to welcome also the online attendees that maybe they are from different parts of the world. And I will not miss the opportunity to tell you, yeah, Professor Fouad introduced me as an assistant professor, but I'm also a researcher and entrepreneur at the College of Agriculture, trying to take research from the lab, not only the field, but also to people. So today, we are celebrating agriculture. We are celebrating system thinking through the different panels we will have in the morning and in the afternoon. This year's motto of Science Week is Shaping the Future. And while we're living in an unpredictable world, I think science can help us to predict, understand, and also to prepare ourselves to the future. It's unpredictable, but at least we can understand and act. Before we begin, I would like to thank the organizing committee, also people who are behind the scene. And I don't want to miss the opportunity to thank the students who are preparing a very nice surprise for you at the end of the day. They made a lot of effort under the leadership of Professor Ali Btay. I really ask you to applaud them all for their effort and time. To begin the day, I would like to invite Professor Bruno Gerard for a welcome word. Yes, please join me. Professor Bruno Gerard is the dean of one of the biggest colleges at the UM6P, and he joined the UM6P as a dean in 2021. He has, after him and also with him, more than 30 years of experience that may be like, that we can feel in his speech. Please, Professor.
Thank you, Manal, for the very kind words, and thanks for being the master of ceremony.
You're welcome.
You do that very well. Welcome. I have the lights in my face, so I don't see you very well, but I think you all move way forward to the scenes. I think it's much nicer for the speakers and the panelists to have you close to us. Proximity is important. This is the 5th edition. I think that's the first edition where we have a big room, a big auditorium for our day. So I would like to thank Fouad and Rashid Serraj also for insisting to be in the big room. Of course, we'll never fill such a large auditorium, but at least we have the feeling to have quite a few people here. I would like to welcome also people who are not coming from UM6P. I know that we have some students from Agroecology being with us this week. We have people from STEPS in North Carolina, and I probably forget quite a few. The college is new. The college is 2 years old, so we are like a baby. The university is almost like a teenager. And why a college? In fact, when research in agriculture was created at UM6P around 2017 with scatter units working on different thematics, different disciplines, different topics. And I think we realized that it was not probably the way to promote integrated research, systemic research, and multidisciplinary research. So the college was created 2 years ago. And we did a survey. Some people say, well, the college is not very useful. I think a majority say it's useful to some extent. You have to realize that change management takes time as well. I think we are on the right step, and we want to promote, and we have a network of very, very good partners. I mean, Ken Gill is one of them, for example, who believe in trying to solve wicked problems in the right way. There are no silver bullets in agriculture. I mean, we'll have a discussion on different things, on agroecology, on digital ag. We'll talk about the digital divide. Those are just tools to solve the problems, but we need to start with the problem, or the problems and the challenges. So there is a large potential in Africa to increase its food production, to increase its food security. You saw the keynote paper of Ken on Monday. I mean, we are not improving in terms of food security and hunger. The last few years have not been good. And we need to understand why. Agriculture is just one sector. You cannot work in agriculture without ignoring the energy, the environment. You need to integrate those, and the economy, of course. So, few striking things, and I think that was in Ken's presentation on Monday, but Africa has very strong drivers when it comes to demographic growth and when it comes to climate change. And one additional problem is that 60% of the population, active population, is employed in agriculture on average in Africa. There are countries with more, countries with less. But agriculture is not very productive and doesn't provide value addition. And it's kind of a vicious cycle, you know. Let's keep people employed, but we don't mechanize, because people say, well, if we mechanize, we'll just maybe kill employment. All those are really complex issues that we need to tackle. And we need to tackle, again, in an integrated manner. The last 3 Science Weeks thematics were complexity. That was 3 years ago. No, 2 years ago. Transitions, that was last year. And shaping the future is this year. And it makes sense. And they are all interlinked. A systemic vision of food security needs to look at those things: complexity, transitions, and shaping the future. As Manal said, we cannot predict the future. And in complex systems, you know, chaos is dominant. We can see emerging properties sometimes in systems, but sometimes we can have incidents that we cannot predict. The worst thing in Africa, I think, is conflicts and the lack of peace. And it's very difficult to develop an economy, to develop the agricultural sector through in countries at war. The second thing is the timid investment of the private sector in Africa. Africa is perceived maybe in the future like some, you know, a continent of potentials, but right now there's very little investment in Africa, and there is no real value addition to African production. You probably follow the story of cocoa and the export, and most of the value that is of African production is not realized and benefiting the Africans. It's going somewhere else. So biomass valorization, value chains is something very important to develop, that the wealth of what is produced by African people benefits Africa. So I will not be much longer, because I see Rashid looking at me saying, well, you're just already talking too much. So we'll have 3 sessions and a keynote by Ken, who will probably be enlightening, and a different one than Monday, so that's for sure. But the first session will be on agroecology. And people like to have words to put on things. And sometimes people are using the same word for different things, or doing the same thing with different labels. And I think that the panel will be quite interesting to discuss that. The second one will be on digital ag and precision agriculture, all those nice technologies. I worked a lot with geospatial data and drones and satellite imagery and all those things. Unless you put those things in context in a, in a systemic problem-solving mind, they are just toys. Huh? And it's nice. If you're a scientist, it's nice to fly your drones and have images and so on. But that's just toys. So I really would like to, I would be interested to listen to the second session as well. The last one is probably, as Manal said, the most interesting one, Manal, because it's the work of our PhD students and postdocs in preparing a session that will close the day. So I wish you all a very, very nice day, and stay with us because I think it will get better and better. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Bruno. It wasn't programmed, but what I have learned from Bruno, and he gave me words from something I lived, is scaling is an art as it is a science. So this is something that entrepreneurs live with. So since we are dealing with people, it's an art. So thank you for the insights, thank you for the knowledge. Now I will call Professor Rachid Serraj, who is the Director of Africa Initiative and also the Vice Dean of Strategy. And I don't want to miss the opportunity to highlight that he's he's been appointed to the steering committee of the high-level panel of experts on food security. Professor Serraj, the mic is yours.
The good news is I don't have a speech, so I'll be very short. I think Bruno has made already the introduction nicely, and we don't want to hold that before we start the sessions. I just wondered, because I'm sure many of you might ask the question, why are we talking about agroecology or agritech? So just very quickly, I'd like to share with you the process. How did we come to this? Actually, Fouad Laroui provoked us from the beginning and sent the ball to all the divisions and colleges and say, no, how does science think? And so what we did, it was a process actually that was bottom-up. We did not decide from the top what to do. We asked actually a whole bunch of people, including students, professors, what would be the topics in agriculture to shape the future? And it's been said, and it's obvious, agriculture is not only a theme for thinking, it's a theme also for eating. That's the food we eat, the environment, the water. And we had a sort of a voting process. We had some people voted for different things. We had also topics like urban agriculture, I think, one of the topics that we might discuss in the future. Because you know urbanization is going on, especially in Africa, and we might have to face it. Anyways, these are the topics that came into on top, agroecology, agritech. The second reason for agroecology, because it's a very controversial topic. I had the privilege, I was based at FAO in 2014, when all the countries of the world met in Rome, trying to sort out and shape up the future on agroecology. And I can tell you one thing is that it was really spectacular. Why spectacular? Because there was no agreement whatsoever. When you bring different components of society, scientists, NGOs, private sector, and break the topics, they don't agree at all on this. And then last year, September 23, there was a special issue coming in Outlook in Agriculture journal, edited by Gilles Lenné. It had, I think, about 12 papers, and I advised the students and maybe some profs, have a look on that. We were hoping to order some of those issues because it goes in all the different aspects of agroecology, and it comes. And we have the privilege. Gilles Lenné will be talking about it. She's the editor of that issue. She will be talking about that. So that's about agroecology and how we came to it. It's a controversial topic, and we need to start the thinking. So that's the response to Fouad. Do we have to think, and does science think? The second one is on agritech, and it's similarly because there are a lot of hopes. And today, I think we have some of the people who are shaping this thinking around agritech. We have Parmesh from the World Bank, and also the FAO, which will show us another aspect of how agritech is being actually implemented on the ground in Africa. Finally, I will stop it here to respond to Fouad. I think not only science thinks, and science must think in terms of agriculture, but science must also act. So what we hope today is that we, as we say in Arabic, in Farga'ur Ramana, we burst the pomegranates. That's our way to get the thinking about these two hot topics. And please be there also in the final session in the afternoon, because this will be exciting session by the students. It has videos, it has debates also that will be live here, the students, on the same topics. So stay tuned, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. And with a great pleasure, I want to welcome on stage Professor Ken Giller, who is the Emeritus Professor at Plant Production Systems at Wageningen University. I will not read his bio, but I will say one sentence. He supported and supervised more than 100 PhD students all over the world. So I think this is just efficient and sufficient to say how great is your impact on the world and in the agricultural sector. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much. And thanks very much to Rashid, to Bruno, to all of you for inviting me here today. And I must say it's a real privilege to be part of this journey with UM6P. When I first visited, there were 2 small buildings on this campus. Every time I come back, I'm amazed at the rate of growth. And I really do believe that UM6P has a central role to play in the developments in Africa in the future, and particularly, of course, through capacity building. Now, the first part of my title, I really covered on Monday, so I'm going to skip over that quite quickly. But the second part of my title, I actually chose around 3 weeks ago, and I didn't realize then how completely relevant it would be to what's happening today, because the last 3 weeks in the world have been fairly turbulent. But I started on Monday with this graph, and I think most of you are there. We start at 100, that's in 1960, and we see food production rising in terms of yields all around the world, except in Africa. And Africa's population, as it's grown, has been fed by that line which has been moving across there to the right. More area harvested. Basically, agriculture has expanded, poorly productive agriculture. That's taken up a lot more land, and there's been very little increase in productivity. So crop yields remain low. We've heard that just from Bruno. But there's increasing demand as the population rises, and as we said in Monday, there'll be an extra 1 billion people in Africa within the next 20 years by 2050. There's an urgent need to increase production, and that's the big opportunity that we face. We should see this not necessarily as the problem, we should see it as the opportunity. So, my signature slide that Shami and others in the audience, we discussed yesterday a lot around Zimbabwe, a slide I took in Zimbabwe when I was professor at the University of Zimbabwe in Mahusekwa, just outside Zimbabwe, on very poor sandy soils which have been cultivated year in, year out, and this is the overriding constraint to productivity, is poor soil fertility. And that's what I really want to focus on today. So on Monday we were talking very much more broadly around food systems. Today we'll focus much more on agriculture. But before I get going, I want to talk about this, the framing of farming. Yeah, we moved 2 letters, and we're talking about how is farming framed? How do we think about farming? And we've already heard some of these terms. So agroecological, but regenerative, organic, traditional, indigenous, alternative, family farming. These are the words that make us feel warm when we're talking about farming. And what we tend to do is we juxtapose that against industrial, large-scale, conventional farming. And I can imagine what was that going on in that discussion, Rashid, in Rome. Different people juxtapose different sides of a coin. But then we ask this question, well, what is conventional agriculture? And when you look into it in detail, and we published a paper there in Global Food Security, Jim Sundberg and I, actually 99% of the farms in the world are conventional family farms. And that is this huge diversity from 10,000 hectare farms to 1 hectare farms. They're all conventional family farms. So what do we do with all this discussion around framing? I'm going to talk a bit about regenerative agriculture, which in many ways in the global debate has almost overtaken agroecology. And we see this term only really appeared and blossomed in terms of the news in around 2016, 2017. Now, I first heard it when I was at a meeting of the Sustainable Sourcing Advisory Board of Unilever. And I was the only agriculturalist in the room. All the others were experts in different fields. And I didn't know what regenerative agriculture was. I hadn't heard of it. So we went home and we did a very quick scan, and that led to this paper, which we published in 2021. And if you look at it, it's been downloaded nearly 100,000 times, yeah? Of all the papers I've written in Outlook on Agriculture, which is a fairly obscure journal, we have to recognize, it was picked up, it was used throughout boardrooms, in companies throughout the world, and I've had more response to this paper than probably anything I've ever written in terms of the speed that it was picked up with. Because this framing, agricultural crisis, this collapse of soil health, the loss of biodiversity, the sixth extinction, plateauing of crop yields, and then here comes regenerative agriculture to save the day, the clarion call. But what is it? And we asked that question. And when the paper came out, somebody high up in one of the major companies in the world, and I won't mention which one, but one of the big 5 food companies came to me and said, "Ken, that's great with your paper. We've just committed $3 billion to regenerative agriculture. Can you help us define what it is?" And of course I said, "But don't we start with the definition and then we make the commitment later?" But regenerative agriculture gained popularity. It started really with farmers, but often livestock farmers on very large farms in the US and in the Antipodes, Australia and New Zealand. It was picked up by NGOs, Nature Conservancy, WWF, Greenpeace, and then the multinationals, Danone, Olam, General Mills, PepsiCo, Nestle, you name it, the World Council for Sustainable Business Development. But what got me really involved in this topic is IKEA Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, starting to push regenerative agriculture very strongly in Africa. Why? Who's asking for it? So here we are, the next agricultural revolution beneath our feet for Nature Conservancy. Farmers in a Greenpeace regenerative farming film. We've got Nestle, General Mills committing 1 million hectares of farmland to regenerative agriculture, Danone regenerative ag, Unilever's 13 principles and implementation guides. We've got regenerative organic, Patagonia, clothing company. We've got the big trading companies, Olam, Natura, Kering, supply chains with a regenerative approach. PepsiCo came in late with a $3 billion investment. 2022, Guinness. Agriculture as good things are taking root, and there's the Guinness planted firmly in the soil. And here in the Financial Times, a spark of an interest in venture capital for regenerative agriculture. This is the only time I've been actually quoted in the Financial Times. I was interviewed for this. What's the investment potential? That was January last year. So it's really everywhere. Now, if we think about the origins of Regen Ag, actually it goes back to the organic agriculture movement in the United States. Robert Rodale, the father of organic agriculture. And it's a bit of a long definition, but it's very much about soil biology, biological stability, having a farm which has no impact on the environment externally, free of biocides, and minimal reliance on non-renewable resources. And Dick Harwood, who many of us knew very well, he was chair of the board of the Tropical Soil Biology and Fertility Program that I was part of. Dick Harwood was one of the early ones talking about this self-reliance, closed nutrient loops. So it's got a very deep rooting in the organic movement. And then here again, the Rodale Institute now in 2019, when this huge explosion came around, oh, it's a new buzzword, but we've lost control of it. It's getting greenwashed. It's taken over by the companies. So what is it? So based on very little literature, but lots of internet searching, because there was very little in the scientific literature, we found these different things being highlighted as principles and practices, and very much a focus on soil health, restoration of soil health, with a bit more, say, lip service towards biodiversity. Now, if we look at these, we'll recognize some of them. You know, minimum till, zero till, very much the conservation agriculture discussion. Maintaining soil cover, building soil carbon, sequestering carbon, big focus on soil carbon. Biological nutrient cycles. I love nitrogen fixation, like you, Siraj. Spent my career working on it, fantastic. But then fostering diversity, integrating livestock, avoiding pesticides, encouraging water percolation. All sensible principles for agriculture, sorry. But some of them are contradictory. If we do zero till and we reduce the use of pesticides, how do we manage weeds? Yeah? Zero till is largely dependent on herbicide use with zero till. So there are contradictions here as well. And when we look at many of those practices, they're fairly fringe. Things like permaculture can work. Obviously, olive groves are permaculture. But permaculture in arable cropping is really very difficult. And when we're talking about compost tea, well, I get a bit worried, yeah? I mean, it's picking up all of these wonderful different things and mixing them together in this sort of soup. Jim Sandberg led this paper just a year ago. Now, what are principles in agronomic discourse? When we look at principles and practices, we find them all through the textbooks in agriculture. Yeah, right, going back to 1914, the fundamental principles of agronomy. A principle is a fundamental truth, if you like. And then we've got ecological agriculture, tropical agronomy, sustainable agriculture, the SCI platform of companies, the principles and practices. So we see it everywhere. And then 6 core principles of regenerative agriculture. In Wageningen, my school, very much we talk of the principles of theoretical production ecology, you know, the defining, limiting, and reducing factors. So there's a long history of principles and practices, and a lovely quote here from Davenport. It's only when subject reaches its scientific stage, it becomes teachable through the elucidation of principles. So principles are clearly a higher order than practices. But we identify then 3 types of principles in agricultural discourse. We've got the explanatory principles, we've got directive principles, and we have normative principles. 3 types. Here they are. So explanatory, this is what we learn in class. Yeah? This is vegetative vigor and reproductive vigor are mutually antagonistic. What you put in the grain, you don't have in the biomass. Yield is dependent on the supply of nutrients. General explanatory principles. But then we have the directive principles. You should keep the soil covered. You have to do everything to build internal strengths. There should directives. We have must do. You must have crop rotations. And then we have the don't do. This is the organic agriculture. We minimize non-renewable resources, but we exclude the use of fertilizers. Yeah? It's a don't do. And then finally, we have the normative principles, and there's a rather long one there from the Sustainable Agriculture Platform, from the companies. And then the value of fairness. That's a normative principle. And when we look at agroecology, and I'll come back to this later, the first 5 there really come into the area of directive in the way that they're framed. You should do this, you should do that. But a lot of these agroecological principles are normative principles, fairness, participation, things that in many ways you can't argue about. They're great, yeah? But it's very normative in the way that they're described. And what we find then in practices, well, actually, the practices usually evolved with very little reference to any of those principles, because practices largely evolve in farming through trial and error. So at a generic level, then these practices also, without any specification, we talk about green manure, but that doesn't really mean much unless we say which green manure in which place. So we say that, Jim says, you know, these are practices in name only, because they need specification. But practices are clearly lower order than principles. So here we are, though. Conservation agriculture has reduced tillage, maintained soil cover, crop rotation. Well, those are really practices, but when we talk about them as the principles of conservation agriculture. So it actually, in our literature, in our thinking in agriculture, we're very confused. Regenerative agriculture, keep the soil covered, build soil carbon. And then particularly the system of rice intensification has things like low plant density, early establishment. They're very much practices, but they're called principles. So we get quite confused. But I think this is the key point I want to make about principles, is that these alternative agricultures, they define themselves through directive and normative principles. That middle bullet is key. None of these different alternatives challenge the scientific principles that underpin agronomy, the basic principles of plant growth. We agree on all of those. So what are principles being used for? They're being used to proclaim these principles, is to exert your authority. It's to bolster your own legitimacy. It's to claim your place in this very crowded and contested marketplace. Now, if you don't believe it's a contested marketplace, look at this. This is the carbon underground. All of these organizations coming together for regenerative agriculture to build carbon underground. So we have the Rodale Institute, we have many different companies there, Ben & Jerry's, you know, ice cream, Danone, you name it. But in the middle there, we've also got Kiss the Ground. I don't know how many people in the room have watched the movie Kiss the Ground. I can't see. Anybody hands up who's watched it? One only? Well, I don't recommend you watch it because I think it's one of the most nauseating documentaries I've ever seen in my life. But what they claim is that building healthy soil solves everything. We've got healthy soil, increased soil carbon, that reverses climate change. I wish. On the right, we've got dead soil, which contributes to all the world's problems. Now, I love soil organic matter, but sometimes we take things a little too far, maybe. Welcome to the future of agriculture. This is the University, California State University, Chico. Are you interested in regenerative agriculture? Well, Dr. David Johnson, he has a fungal-dominated compost which sequesters carbon. You make it in this beam bioreactor. You apply 3 kilos per hectare of this fungal-dominated biomass, and if you can read it, I'll read it out to you, you get a 25 times increase in soil fungal biomass, but a storage of 10 metric tons of carbon per hectare, which is 20 to 50 times the currently observed soil carbon increase. Are we taking things a little too far? I actually was introduced to this by Unilever because Ben & Jerry's wanted to invest in this. I cautioned them. This is not possible. The laws of mass deny it. Here we have Dr. Elaine's soil food web approach. It's working on 6 continents. We can reduce chemical inputs by 100% while increasing yields 150% and saving 50% of the water. How do we do it? Well, just sign up. It's only $5,000 for the course. And I've met several people who've paid and done this course, actually. But the claims are bizarre. 150% increase while reducing chemical inputs by 100%. Then we have FAO. FAO, Rashid, your organization. 10 children's stories on the magical world of soil biodiversity. And I really start to wonder if the world is going mad. And then some caution in this Civil Eats. It's an online news around food. The white paper from Rodale and the Carbon Underground said that if we adopt regenerative practices, we can forget all other types of mitigation because we can sequester all of the carbon that we're emitting. But then even the critics even started to say this is not possible. Even the people who were promoting regenerative agriculture, even Ratan Lal, actually came out and said, sorry guys, this is taking it too far. It can't do that. It can't actually mop up all of the carbon we're emitting. And we produced a paper on this, my colleagues Gabriel Moinet and Renske Heibeek, around soil carbon, because yes, we do want more carbon in our soils, but we want it there for healthy soils so that we can use nutrients efficiently. We shouldn't be using soils to mop up carbon as the main aim. And that's explained in this rather complicated graph, but at the top, we have that dotted line. That's a constant rate of carbon sequestration. In the bottom graph, you see that line going up linearly. And most of the extrapolations that were done early on the rate of carbon sequestration were done using a constant rate into the future. Now, if you do that at the top, where it says constant rate, you'll see that nice green area. That's the contribution to mitigating climate change to 1.5 degrees. If we have a slow attenuation, so our rate of carbon sequestration goes down, then we get the slow decrease in the middle. If the rate of soil carbon sequestration goes down quickly, the fast decrease, you can actually see the contribution to mitigation is actually very small. And unfortunately, all of the data we have would indicate that you actually have a fast decrease in the rate of carbon sequestration. Therefore, the amounts we can lock up in soils are actually more limited than these very early projections. But it's actually even more confusing, because we often claim we build soil carbon, we get better yield. But when we look at the data from long-term experiments around the world, if we correct for the inputs of N, P, and K, so we correct for the nutrient additions, and then we look, well, what effect did soil carbon have if we correct for those nutrient additions? We actually find in most cases there's no effect on yield, or there's a negative effect in yield. In the blue is one example where there's a positive effect, and this table is actually a very large table. This is a small selection from it. But the big problem is that when we use an agricultural practice to increase crop yield or to increase soil carbon, both go up. So both soil carbon increases and yield increases. But we don't know if soil carbon is actually then driving crop yield, or the increase in productivity is driving soil carbon. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? So causality is very problematic, and when we really look at the impacts of soil carbon, we can very rarely find direct effects on yield which aren't attributable to nutrients. But that doesn't stop us being out there actually starting to sell carbon credits to farmers. So our main points of critique about Regen Ag are this huge diversity of agriculture, this huge diversity of what we'd call conventional agriculture or whatever, means that the starting points are hugely different. In Africa, we need more nutrients. In the Netherlands, where I live, the country's flooded with nitrogen from animal manure, and we need to reduce the number of animals and we reduce the nutrients. But very little attention is given to these starting points, to the local context. The second point there, on the third bullet, is that all agrochemicals are bundled under one thing, where our concerns for human health are hugely different. Fertilizers, if used well, are environmentally benign. They don't damage the environment. But pesticides are designed to kill things, hopefully selectively, whether herbicides, insecticides, fungicides. So they differ enormously. Some are biocides. They kill life, yeah? And they can be very toxic to people. So we need to handle them very differently. But we shouldn't bundle fertilizers and pesticides under one banner as agrochemicals. And having said that, in this whole debate about regen ag, if we do away with pesticides, there's very little discussion about the alternative methods of pest and disease control. And then finally, there's very much focus on what's going on in practices in the farm, in the fields, with no idea really of the broader ecological footprint, or this whole idea of land sparing. If we want biodiversity, the best way is to have high yields on our agricultural land and to leave land aside for nature. Now, coming back to this issue of how we're going to produce our food in the future, you've seen the graph, you've seen the photo. Coming back to our question around soil fertility. When we analyze on the right-hand side then, the cereal area harvested against the N use per hectare, you can see around the world, nitrogen use has really gone up alongside the increase in yields. The proportional increase in North America and Europe, the green and the grey, is much smaller because already in 1960 they were using quite some fertilizer. If you look at Africa, Africa took off like a rocket in terms of fertilizer use in the 1960s, until we introduced structural adjustment in the 1980s and all subsidies were wiped out in Africa, not in Asia. And then nitrogen use declined and has stagnated. So we could argue, actually, this increase in the area harvested in order to feed people, that has been the major driver of land use change. The lack of nutrients being used in agriculture has driven land use change. It's driven the loss of forests. It's driven the loss of biodiversity. Now, a slide I took in Zimbabwe back in the 1990s. We've known for years how to close yield gaps, how to produce good crops. Here on a poor sandy soil, a well-fertilized maize crop in the background against an unfertilized maize crop in the foreground. But when we look at agroecology, we have this second principle. It's a principle. We have to reduce inputs. We have to reduce or eliminate dependency on purchased inputs, increase self-sufficiency. Well, this is wrong. The input principle is wrong when it comes to mineral fertilizer use in sub-Saharan Africa. And I was delighted for this special issue that with Jill Lenay that Rashid introduced. My colleagues from CIRAD, Gatien and his colleagues, came together with me to write this paper because they are promoting the agroecological transition in Africa, but their definition of agroecology doesn't eschew the use of fertilizer. And we argue very strongly that we need more fertilizer. And yesterday and on Monday, of course, I have to talk about these wonderful nitrogen-fixing legumes, which can really fix nitrogen from the atmosphere and contribute. It's where my career's been built, is really looking at the benefits of these legumes in nitrogen fixation of all types. Here's a nice example in Ethiopia. In the foreground, beans with no rhizobium, with no phosphorus. In the background, look at the difference, yeah? To get a productive crop for the farmers standing there looking at this wonderful bean crop. That's food for them. That's going to leave some nitrogen in the soil. But we need the phosphorus to actually drive the legume growth. In Rwanda, I showed this slide on Monday. On the left, beans with no manure or fertilizers. On the right, Mrs. Gasolida standing inside this wonderful bean crop. And they say in Rwanda, you can't grow beans unless you own a cow, because you need that little bit of manure in the planting hole. And then you need the phosphorus as well to boost that growth. And then you get the benefits of nitrogen fixation. And I showed this slide on Monday as well. And if we grow climbing beans, then the maize after climbing beans on the right grows much better than maize after maize. This is a slide my friend Bernard van Lau took in South Kivu. So we had 5 reasons in this paper why more mineral fertilizer is needed. That basically agricultural production, we could argue, in Africa is agroecological by default. We have poor soil fertility because we're mining the soil year in, year out without anything back. Those nitrogen needs cannot be met solely by biological nitrogen fixation or recycling of manure. There simply isn't enough manure to go around. Nutrients like phosphorus and potassium need to be replaced. Mineral fertilizer, if used well, cause little harm to the environment, and if we reduce the use of mineral fertilizers, we would hamper gains in productivity, we would contribute to hunger, and we would contribute indirectly to agricultural expansion and to deforestation. So I think these are 5 very powerful arguments why that principle of agroecology really does not work in Africa. I also wrote this paper we call Grounding the Helicopters, which is really about this whole idea. Who's deciding on the research agenda? Yeah? We have these people out there in different parts of the world saying what should be happening in Africa. And here's a paper which is actually asking a question. It's not my paper. Is agroecology a form of neo-colonialism? The coloniality of agroecology in Senegal. These authors actually were studying there that the development actors in West Africa are coming from outside and they're promoting something which doesn't actually fit. It's a form of neo-colonialism, they argue. In Europe, we have this huge rise of regenerative agriculture and the development of what they call the farm-to-fork strategy, endorsed by scientists, the Scientific Advisory Council. But what does that do for Africa? If the EU reduces yields, what impact would that have in terms of the spillover? And the conclusion here, it's a report written by the DPM, advisory body. I was helped in some of the background discussion with them. It would probably create higher prices, increase global food security in Africa. So it's likely Africa will be particularly affected, and we would probably increase greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity loss. So if we reduce production in one area of the world, does that actually then lead to spillover effects elsewhere? How do we think about avoiding chemicals? We've actually got things in plant resistance to diseases like late blight, terrible disease, which can save 15 or more fungicide sprays per crop. In the Netherlands, they say 15 times a season in potatoes to avoid late blight. But we have resistant potato varieties available, but they're not allowed to be used because we eschew the use of genetic manipulation approaches, even Casper-Chris approaches. And now, the last example I want to use is one I've been very closely involved in, is that many claims now, we're always looking for alternatives. We can't use fertilizer, we have to use nitrogen-fixing bacteria. But we had this article, it actually was in Dutch, in a Dutch magazine, where I was quoted, actually, serious doubts about these biological alternatives. Now, what were the doubts? Well, if we look at some of the products being sold at the moment, this is one from Corteva, and this is a screenshot I took of their slides when they were presenting this to me after our article came out. They have Utrisha N. How does it work? The bacterium enters the cells, enters the plant through the stomata. It colonizes the whole plant. They claim it's there in every cell in the plant. It converts nitrogen in the atmosphere to ammonia, which can be used by the plant. No energy is required for this process, and it can supply nitrogen throughout the life of the crop. It's magic. It's wonderful. But the bacteria they're using is a thing called Methylobacterium symbioticum. And we could show that their bacterium doesn't have nitrogenase. It can't actually fix nitrogen. And then we have the Sustainable Nitrogen Foundation, which is now promoting inoculants like this in Africa. in Rwanda, and actually in Guinea, I think, the other country. And their scientific evidence are 3 very dubious reports making all sorts of claims with no proper scientific backing. Now, that led us to write this paper, which was published in October last year, which has caused huge ripples in the industry. This is an industry currently around these inoculants and biostimulants, which is worth millions a year, over 1 million hectares actually under these inoculants in the United States. And they don't work. We can show very clearly that despite 50 years of research, there is no evidence that they produce agronomically significant amounts of nitrogen from the atmosphere. We argue that we should have regulations, and the first that should be independently verified before these products come on the market, because there are no regulations at the moment. The first is they should at least have nitrogenase. But then these other points, to protect nitrogenase from oxygen, which poisons it, that the bacteria is present in enough numbers, that you should find enhanced respiration as its fixation, you should be able to inoculate a non-legume in an N-free medium, it should go green, and we should be able to measure nitrogen in the field. All 5 of those have never been shown for any of these other products. And yet they're there on the market. And what's happened is that scientists have had their wonderful little experiments in the glasshouse. They've extrapolated things to the field, and they're claiming things which are not true. So it's not just the companies who are at fault here, it's also the scientists who are promoting things that they can't actually provide good evidence for. Now, I talk about populism. Now, why do I talk about populism? Well, after our paper came out, Frédéric Goulet, a scientist from CIRAD, who's now at CIMIT in Mexico, got in touch with me because he's been studying the explosion of microbial products in Latin America. And what he told me is that Bolsonaro basically tore up the rule book. They had all sorts of regulations about what sort of products had to be tested and sold, and he just basically threw all the rules out of the window. All regulations about quality control. So farmers can make any cocktail they like. It could be as toxic as anything, because if you do microbiology in your backyard, you never know what you're growing. And this is what's happening today if we look at the United States, unfortunately. They're just tearing up the rule book. And we actually need regulation to protect farmers from dubious products for which people are making money. What we see now, though, is this was something from the UK just last year. More projects, all projects about nitrogen fixation research. These are based on thin air. So what's our role as scientists and educators? And I love this cartoon. Philippe Bavet highlighted it first when he was talking about soil health. But we've got the whole population walking towards this bookcase, this fount of knowledge. And what we're doing is we're just all turning left and following the crowd. We're not thinking. The world is a complex place. The problems we face are complex. They're thorny problems. We don't have simple answers. But it's our job is to turn right, to engage with knowledge, to study those books, to look for solutions in an interdisciplinary way, in the way that your college is planning to do in future, but to grapple those problems and then to look for solutions. But what are we faced with? This is in biogeochemistry from a very eminent scientist. Kiss the ground and make a wish. Soil science and Hollywood. This is where we've ended up. There's so much attention to soils. There's so much excitement about a potential which maybe can't be realized, that people can make any claim they like at the moment, and those claims are not being challenged. And in the biostimulant side, this is now a $9 billion industry worldwide, which is one way ahead of any scientific basis. So I think science is a key crossroads. The scale of the challenges that we face are absolutely daunting, and in society we must make difficult choices on complex questions. We have to move away from this simple but very false dichotomies. Organic, agroecology is good, conventional is bad. It's nonsense. All agriculture sits somewhere in the middle of all that. I think money should be following science, but at the moment, science is just rushing around following the money. We're not in control as scientists of the science agenda, and we have to take that back. We need to be simple and clear in communication. And we're always told, but if you talk to the minister, we have to give them a very simple message. I disagree. As scientists, we have to put our messages out there in a very clear way, but it shouldn't be simplistic. I've written papers in Outlook on Agriculture, Plant and Soil. They're having massive impact in policy. I don't bother translating them into policy briefs because the scientists who are advising the ministers read these things and they come back to us and they engage in discussion. So we can use the scientific literature as a way of getting that out, peer-reviewed, fully checked by other scientists. So be active, get engaged, be heard, be part of the argument, but base your arguments on science and not on some emotion of a world that you'd love to have, but you can't back up with the arguments. So my final point is that there is absolutely no room for dogma or populism in science. Science is about disagreement, it's about grappling with problems, but it's not about simple solutions, dogmatic solutions, and belief systems. So with that, I thank a lot of different co-authors. I point you to our book on African food security, which is free to download on the internet, and that goes into a much more complex arena. And I direct you as well to this website, Table Debates, where we actually try and grapple with many of these different issues. It's run by the Swedish University, by Oxford, by Wageningen and collaborators. So watch that. There's lots of really good stuff there, trying to engage and grapple with these very difficult debates. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Giller, for your words. And I took many take-home messages. I don't have a pen, but the things that really I will keep in my mind that the scale of the challenge, the context are very important. And I don't know how we can help or encourage our students to not to follow the crowd and to think out of the box. The path is not easy, actually, Professor. So for students and attendees, we will take the most of the presence of Professor Giller here to have the maximum of questions. So this is the good news I have today, is that we will have a session of question and answers, and we will not have a break. So sorry for that.
No coffee.
Yeah, and sure. So I would like to take the first 3 questions. Yeah, we have first one here, second one, and third one. So please, I need one mic here. Thank you so much for your assistance. Thank you. And another one, please. You will be the second and the third. Okay, thank you so much. And first, yeah, please. Please stand up, present yourself, and go directly to the question.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for your efforts. My question will be, don't you think that the human being is a bit contradictory? Because he creates what destroys the environment and then starts looking for solutions. He built bombs, cars, factories, and chemicals that harm the soil, air, and ecosystem. He produces processed foods and diseases that he then claims to be searching for solutions to the very problems he caused. He develops medicines for illnesses he contributes to, organizes peace summits for wars he initiated, and seeks environmental solutions for the destruction he is responsible for. Don't you think that the claim of finding solutions for environmental and soil issues is more profit-driven than a genuine concern for the planet?
So I think to summarize your point is that many companies are presenting themselves as being very green and good for the environment when they're doing the opposite. I think that's in essence what you're asking. Is that right? Sort of? Because I find this quite a difficult one. We tend, I've been involved in, at a high level in advising big companies, Nestle, Unilever, others, these big multinationals. And I think certainly in the past, Unilever had a very, very strong sustainability agenda. And they saw sustainability as a way that it would cost them money now, but it would build them a longer-term future. And obviously, for many of these companies, their value is the brands, yeah? You see a brand, you think, oh, that's a product I want to buy. And so they protect that brand by having good publicity, often related to the environment. Now, the big question, I suppose, is, do we believe them or not? And I think there are companies I see making claims, I think, no, I don't believe that. And there are other companies making claims, well, I know the programs they're running, I think they're doing their best, yeah? And I think one of the big problems is that we have very little monitoring and evaluation. I have another presentation I couldn't talk about now on that. But I think we need ways of holding these companies to account. So they make a claim, we're going to halve our carbon footprint by 2030. Nestle have said this in their coffee and cocoa chains. Well, we have to hold them to account. So they actually asked me, how can we do this? I said, well, first of all, you need a baseline. Oh, what do you mean? I said, well, you need to measure all your nitrous oxide emissions in your cocoa and coffee plantations, so we have a baseline, and then we can see in 5 years' time whether you've changed or not. Well, that costs them quite a lot of money. I mean, we're running a program with them to make that baseline. So I think that we need accountability, absolutely, but I would be very worried if we dismiss these sustainability programs. I don't think the companies spend enough on them. It's probably less than 0.5% of their income, and they should be spending much more. But I think we need those companies to be helping us. So I'm a bit confused. I'm a bit split on this, but I don't think we should write them off. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. Yeah, and this reminds me of the title of the paper you showed, Green Agriculture, White Market. Actually, the market is not convinced sometimes about quality of the product or even the sustainability of the lands you are working on. So we need to find this balance or, I don't know how to say it, but trade-off between both. Yeah. And as you said, human is complex, and this is what makes it beautiful to be a human being. Yeah, we have
a good question.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We have additional question here. And please, for the other three questions, please prepare yourself, so we'll have another round.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Zakaria Aboueder from Master Criminal Policy and Digital Transformation from Kadaya de Marrakesh. My question is, how much is important to support the African agriculture companies to save or to save the security food in this country in Africa? So, what is the important to support the African agriculture company to save the food? And thank you.
I'm not 100% sure of what you're asking. You're asking about how we can support African companies? So, yeah, I mean, so we got companies in all directions. I mean, I think what I see in the role of companies, if you like, in getting agriculture moving in terms of production is both ends. I think we need much, much better efficient supply chains on the input side to make sure that we can get inputs to farmers in remote areas very quickly at the right time of year, and we need good markets at the other end. But the problem really is that we deal with a situation where the margins are very tight, and therefore it's not so profitable, and people don't want to go into risky areas. So I think some ways of actually underwriting the risk of companies to actually operate in difficult areas would be a great way to get started. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question correctly. The rules?
I'm asking you about the rules of the African companies to save the food for Africa. This is my question.
The rules?
How can the companies help to save the food for Africa?
But do you mean in terms of food safety or food preservation?
Food safety, yes.
Availability.
Security food.
Yeah, I'm not sure we're talking on the same level. I mean, on the same wavelength. I mean, food waste is a huge issue.
Yeah.
But that waste is very often post-harvest loss at farm level rather than necessarily loss in the food chain. So, I mean, I think that it goes back again, I think, to having good infrastructure and good market links to make sure that these are efficient and that we don't have wastage there. Maybe we should talk afterwards at coffee, and you can explain a bit more what you mean.
I'm saying, how can the companies help to save the food for Africa? I'm asking about the food safety or the food security.
You see, so I mean, I understand food security in a very general way, which is yeah, a lot to do with availability of
about
food.
the Africa regulation.
Sorry?
Africa regulation.
Regulations.
Yes.
Well, I mean, obviously many people argue that regulations stop innovation. I'm not sure that's necessarily true. I think there are a lot of probably quite good regulations here in Africa already, but we have actually no way of enforcing them, so that the regulatory bodies don't exist to actually make sure, for instance, fertilizers that are being sold are actually of the quality they claim. So I think there's a huge amount for governments to do to actually make sure that they can impose or make effective the regulations they have in place. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
We have another question in the same line.
Hello, everyone. Like my classmate is talking about law in general and companies, how it can help like to offer food security and stuff. First of all, I want to present myself. I'm Lubna from like criminal and science masters, and also policy, science, criminal and digital translation. Here we would to talk like about the role of law and the digital translation related to what you talk about, Professor, like agriculture, especially when we talk about sheep in the future, like how law and, for example, the AA can evolve that domain in nowadays, especially when we talk about saving foods and also protecting them when we talk about climate changes, like how AA and law, especially when we talk about Morocco, because Morocco, as you know, agriculture is the most domain we have in Morocco, like when we talk about economics. So how Morocco can evolve that domain when we talk about what did you say in details? Thank you.
Yeah, you see, I'm no expert on Morocco, I'm afraid, so I think you really have to direct your questions to the agricultural experts who do know the country. I'd say, in general, you know, we're talking about shaping the future, and I'm talking very much about the role of science and what it should play in future. My own feeling about AI and the like is that at the moment our databases, the data that we have on agriculture in Africa is so bad in terms of production, consumption from every side, that letting loose you know, random forest models doesn't help us very much because we don't have the detail of data that we need to do some of the clever things that we'd like to, and that we really need to invest hugely actually in data systems before we can be in a position to really benefit from some of the opportunities that digital approaches would really offer.
Thank you. We have a question from Professor Nadia.
Thank you, Professor. I have one question. If I can ask you about your own definition about agroecology. You know, it's such difficult to define this concept between the North and the South. And I have studied years before the form and the fork strategy in the in UE. And the most difficult for me is to realize that there is a lot of difference between the European definition of agroecology and the African one. So what is for you the more balanced definition of agroecology? Thank you.
Yeah, you see, it doesn't interest me all that much in some ways. There was if you look at the way agroecology has been used in the academic literature, and particularly University of Hohenheim, there was a professor of tropical agroecology, Joachim Sauerborn, and his definition was very much a way of using ecological principles in agriculture. I published a paper in '95 on on the use of ecological principles in agriculture. I'm trained actually as an ecologist originally. And I think systems like an ecologist because the context determines everything. But what worries me in a way is that his definition is a very strict German definition, if you like. You know, Germans are known for being very strict on things. But then agroecology got picked up by Altieri, and particularly in Latin America, with Via Campesina movements and the like, and with Altieri, it really became very much more a belief system. It's very much about social movements. It's very much about bottom-up participation. It's not necessarily so much about the principles of agricultural production at all. And so we start to mix all of these normative principles with our explanatory principles, yeah? And I think we should just get beyond all of this rhetoric, actually, because it doesn't worry me too much if it's agroecology or regenerative or whatever. We have to look, we have some guidelines in our paper which say, first of all, what's the problem? What can we do to address it? And how do we make it work effectively, yeah? And I mean, I think every local situation, let's go there without too much baggage, engage with the problem. If in one situation we don't need fertilizers, brilliant. If in another we do, perfect. But let's make sure that whatever we do it in a way which is good for people and good for the environment. I don't want to get involved in the discussion on the perfect definition, because I don't think we'll have one which will satisfy everybody. Anyway, sorry.
We have another question from Kautar. Please stand up.
Thank you, Professor, for your insightful presentation. I appreciate you integrated agroecology and agri-technology, and I believe that as a researcher, the point is to help farmer adopt such agro-technology. And I'm still wondering if the farmer nowadays are adopting the technology we deliver, because many of them in the African context are still so behind because of lack of subsidies and so on. So what do you think? How can we encourage the farmer and to adopt the technologies we deliver? Because if not, the point of what we are doing as researcher is kind of useless if they're not adopting it.
I mean, I just think we have to try harder. That's in its essence. You know, when I was at a meeting a week or so ago on biostimulants and this blue N with Corteva, I was listening in the audience. We had 100 people in the room in the Netherlands. And of course, farmers have got all access to all of this sort of knowledge and all these products. But when you look at it in the Netherlands now, there are only 50,000 farmers in total, yeah? In total, in the whole of the Netherlands. In Africa, nearly every village, you have 50,000 farmers. We're talking about millions and millions and millions of farmers. So the scale of the problem in terms of communication, in terms of delivery and everything, is orders of magnitude more difficult. In situations where we don't have infrastructure, in terms of good roads and good communication networks and everything. So, I mean, the task is huge. But that's why we need to work harder and get on with it, yeah?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I just open remark for the organizers. I would love to next time to have farmers among us. We need to hear feedback from them.
Sure.
Because we are doing it for them.
Good point.
Yeah. Thank you, Kautar, for the advice. I'm sure professors will take notes about that. We have one last winning question. Karim, please. Thank you.
So thank you, Professor, for your nice presentation. So a couple of other examples of other cases linked to plant protection. We have Sri Lanka in 2020. They banned the glyphosate. Justification was as a pesticide, toxic and harmful for farmers. The impact was a huge reduction in terms of yield for different crops, such as a stable crop of rice.
Yeah.
The second example is the use of a couple of insecticides belong to neonicotinoid families by the European Union. So the first example, the decision from the government of Sri Lanka was by the pressure of the public decision. So the second example, which is the ban of neonicotinoid, was from the scientific evidence, which is the impact on the bee health.
Yeah.
So the question is, so how can we have a balanced decision without having the pressure from the public decision? So can we have a good decision?
Well, I think a vocal civil society is very good to hold politicians to account, and we need that. But it needs to be a civil society which is well informed. And on some of those points that you raise, I think the science is very difficult. You know, I mean, is glyphosate toxic? Well, I mean, even toxicologists disagree on that. A lot would say that it's not, but of course, then you find evidence that it starts to appear in all sorts of places that we don't want it, such as in milk and the like, you know, residues. I think the argument with neonicotinoids is a very difficult one because they, and I'm not an expert on this, but they are very persistent in the environment, and they do have negative effects on non-target organisms. Now, if we're going to get rid of them, what do we put in their place? And this is actually the point I was trying to make around that there's very little discussion in this whole issue around agroecology or regenerative agriculture. It's all focused on soils and soil health and sort of nutrient cycles. There's very little attention to alternative methods of pest and disease control. The example I gave with Phytophthora, that we've got this genetic resistance in plants. I mean, I think that's something we need to exploit, but then maybe we need to accept that we have to use genetic manipulation technologies and things. But some people don't want them. But if they're going to save on use of chemicals, I don't see the problem. We're using the best of biology to solve a problem. If we're, like in the States, they were talking there about using triple stacked herbicide resistance so you can spray more diverse herbicides. I think that's a wrong use of genetic engineering, yeah? So, I mean, I think, again, it's not saying GM's good, GM's bad. GM could really help us under some circumstances for some problems. But we shouldn't throw any of the tools in our toolbox out because the problems are huge. I think the whole issue with civil society, though, is that we do need civil society voice, but you know, we need to inform people so people are speaking from an informed perspective and not just from the way that you feel about something, because I think that the discussion and debate is often at such a low level. You shouldn't do that, you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't do that, without actually having good arguments behind it. So it's our job as scientists and educators to get out there and educate people and join in this sort of difficult debate, I'd say.
Thank you, Professor Giller. Thank you for your presentation, your Q&A questions, answers, and I will invite you to join the panel, but now I don't want you to go back to your seat and come here, so please just sit next to me. And now we will start our session on agroecology.
Professor, can I have one last question, if it is possible? I'm here.
We will start our session on agroecology. I've prepared the definition, but in order not to fall into populism of the definitions, I will invite our panelists, and we will start first with an impressive presentation on agroecology done by Professor Jill. She's online with us, and I'm so happy so honored to have her today, because she's a source of inspiration for scientists, decision makers, but also many women in science. So big applause to her. She's a fighter. She's been fighting on agroecology for more than 40 years in different research centers. So you're welcome, Professor Jill. You can share your presentation.
Gerard?
Yes.
Agroecology. It's a topic that I have been interested in for the past 15 years.
So we have 15 minutes. Would you like to go back or just sit here?
So I was asked to prepare a thought-provoking presentation to stimulate discussion. I'm first going to address the context. That is, are agroecological approaches for future food production in Africa appropriate? Then I'll briefly look at the history with a focus on the international promotion of agroecology in recent years. I'll look in more detail at two main agroecological paradigms and their implications, and I'll conclude with some suggestions for a potential way forward. The main reason why agroecology is being promoted as an alternative is a belief that the existing food production system of monocultures and chemical inputs is broken, and the main cause of agroecosystem degradation and biodiversity loss. There is truth in this, particularly where monocultures where chemical inputs and monocultures are abused, but in many cases, they are not broken. And the replacement for agroecology has been at the forefront of calls for alternatives. What appears to be forgotten in all of this is that for the past 60 years, modern agriculture has successfully increased global food production by almost 400%, with only a 10 to 15% expansion of cultivated land, and as well it feeds 90% of the global population. And what seems to be neglected is the importance of food security in future agricultural transformation strategies. Let's briefly look at food security in Africa, and I will focus particularly on SDG 2.3, which aspires to doubling the agricultural productivity and incomes of small-scale food producers, particularly women, indigenous peoples and family farmers. It is very important, but a very difficult challenge. A recent paper by Professor Ken Giller, who is a member of the discussion panel, concluded that smallholder farmers lack sufficient land and/or economic incentives to invest in agriculture, even with greater public sector involvement in development and promotion of novel crop technologies. And he said it creates a conundrum. It's a wicked problem for future food security in Africa. But for me, it opens the door for opportunistic promotion of inappropriate technologies. So let's briefly look at the history of agroecology. The term was first coined 100 years ago, and it was used to describe the science of crop production and protection. It was sort of forgotten in the interim 50 years, and in the 1970s and 1980s, it was revived as a crop garden production system, low input, diverse, traditional agriculture, considered a nature-based model. Today, agroecology has evolved into a broad mixture of science, practices, and social movements, and it's strongly promoted by activists, NGOs, and some UN agencies such as FAO. And there are many different definitions and no internationally recognized definition of agroecology. So there's a lot of confusion about what agroecology actually is, and interpretation varies from rational to radical. Now, I'll just give some examples of the confusing aspects of agroecology. So common farming practices, such as intercropping, crop rotation, cover crops, regenerative agriculture, recycling manure and compost are considered agroecological, and many of them have been around for well over 100 years. But widespread farming practices, such as monocultures of improved conventionally bred and GM crop varieties, are excluded. They're considered to be unnatural, vulnerable to pests and diseases, and unstable. Additionally, chemical inputs such as fertilizers and pesticides are largely excluded because they're considered to be harmful to the environment. But there's very limited or often exaggerated evidence presented to support the exclusion of such important technologies. A key development was the internationalization of agroecology in 2009 through an extensive consultation process to produce a report, Agriculture at a Crossroads. But the consultation was selective, and as a result, identifying future strategies for food production was somewhat compromised. So the report recommended profound transformation, replacement of modern agriculture by species diversity, greater use of traditional crops, reliance on vegetational diversity for pest and disease control, largely rejection of synthetic inputs and GM crops, and that is more or less organic production, and it was considered to be more natural. The World Bank, which was one of the main funders of the exercise, did an evaluation, an independent evaluation, approximately a year afterwards. And they said that the IASTD was a useful experience at the nexus of politics and science. However, agricultural technology, with its complexity, diversity, and politics, proved to be a bridge too far. They considered overall it was a missed opportunity, and it was very expensive at $12 million US dollars. I'd like to highlight 2 points they made. Firstly, they considered it to be a radical transformation of present chemical-based industrial and conventional food and agricultural production systems towards agroecology. And they concluded that widespread adoption of the dominant IASTD options would lead to reduced productivity gains and more environmental damage through extensification. But there was another issue in the IASTD process and reports that was not picked up by the World Bank report. The global report was a collation or summary of 5 subglobal reports from Latin America and the Caribbean, Eastern and Southern Asia and the Pacific, North America and Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Central West Asia and North Africa. As you can see by the table, the global report was dominated by a focus on the Latin American sub-global report. And support for agroecology in Sub-Saharan Africa and Central and West Asia and North Africa was very low. And in fact, 67% of African countries did not endorse the IASTD report, presumably because they didn't want to erect barriers to future accessing of new technologies, which they needed. About 5 years ago, FAO and the high-level panel of experts for food security and nutrition coined 10 aspirational elements and 13 aspirational principles, which were largely based on the main recommendations of the IAASTD. And I want to focus on 2 of these because I think they're the most relevant in the context of future sustainable crop production for food security. And these are the diversity and biodiversity paradigm and the input reduction and elimination paradigm. But I also want to point out that I consider there's a very important missing principle element, and that's water management. When you consider that the IAASTD Global Report mentions water management over 2,000 times, and the IAASTD Central West Asia North Africa Subglobal Report mentions water scarcity and management over 1,300 times, it's rather perplexing that integrated water resources management is not included either as an element or a principle. So firstly, looking at the diversity and biodiversity paradigm. So the call is for diversification, for agroecological transitions to ensure food security and nutrition. Yes, but not provable. And also a call for maintaining and enhancing diversity of species, functional diversity, genetic resources, maintaining overall agroecosystem biodiversity in time and space, field, farm and landscape levels. Now I've included this slide to ask some questions. We have an intercrop of maize and cowpea, and we have a monoculture of maize. And I'm asking which is better, on what basis, and which is more diverse. The monoculture definitely is morphologically uniform, but it may be highly functionally diverse. It may have resistances to diseases, tolerances of pests, nutrient use efficiency traits, nutritional traits, drought tolerance. You cannot tell by looking at it as a monoculture. So you need to be very careful about how you judge certain agroecosystems. For me, the basic point is that the intercrop feeds families, the monoculture feeds cities and nations and reduces the need to rely on imported food. So looking at diversity, what are the implications of growing more diversity in agroecosystems? The emphasis is on traditional and indigenous crops, and for me they have unproven food security potential, particularly as 70% of food production in Africa is from introduced crops. Embodied in this is the rejection of improved crop varieties with important traits, including GM crops, because they're perceived to be owned by multinational companies. The efforts of public sector organisations is not acknowledged. It implies in-field diversity with the complexities of planting, managing and harvesting mixed crop stands, highly labour intensive, and most of this is the burden of women. There's a limited science base for pest and disease management through diversity, and improved ecosystem services appear to override food production. A little bit more information about how modern agroecosystems are functionally diverse, both at crop and field level. These are just examples, there are many more. For example, the number of land races used in improving Simmet wheat varieties and Iri rice varieties had increased 6 to 10-fold in the past 40 years. The Iri mega variety, IR64, has grown over 50 million hectares in Southeast Asia, has 79 parents in its pedigree. GM technologies, adding further diversity for pest and disease resistance and nutrition in African crops. Intercropping cereals and legumes improves soil N, but it does not eliminate fertiliser use. And crop livestock systems produce about 50% of the world's food, and in the global south it's actually more than that. As I said before, diversity cannot consistently manage pests. And again, these are just examples. I'd particularly like to focus on the meta-analysis of 132 studies at over 6,500 sites by Karp et al. Showed no consistent improvement in pest management. A study of intercrops using 25 different legume species, a recent study, discovered limited data on the mechanistic basis of natural enemy pest interactions, and there was poor science. The only agroecosystem where 4 decades of research supports a role for natural pest control is tropical irrigated rice. But even in this case, there are caveats. So looking at the second paradigm, input reduction or elimination, where the call is to reduce or eliminate dependency on purchased inputs and increase self-sufficiency, and preferentially to use local renewable resources as far as possible. What are the implications? Obviously, reduction or elimination of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and a reliance on organic fertilizers through recycling, composting of local renewable resources, including manure. Now, a recent study has shown that the greenhouse gas emissions from the recycling and composting processes produce almost as much greenhouse gas emissions as does the use of chemical fertilizers. Input reduction basically means maintaining the status quo in Africa. And it implies lower yielding organic type agriculture. Many studies have shown 25% reduction in yield, and there are also studies which show 40 to 50% reduction. And if there's land available, it will result in extensification and biodiversity loss. There have been a number of studies recently on fertilizer reduction and the fact it will reduce yields and contribute to extensification. A recent study by Falconia et al., and I understand that 2 of the authors on this paper are actually members of the discussion panel. It concluded that reliance of arable farmers on local composted renewable biomass and nitrogen fixation by legumes instead of chemical fertilizers is highly inappropriate for smallholder farmers in Africa, where most soils are degraded. And also a recent study looked at recycling animal manure, which is very common in Africa, but it concluded there's not enough, and the N and P levels do not match crop nutrient needs. The fact is that average per hectare chemical fertilizer application in Africa is 16 kilos, compared to 128 in the US, 187 in Latin America and the Caribbean, and 290 in East Asia. So reducing the use of chemical fertilizers would definitely hamper productivity gains and contribute to agricultural expansion. And farmers in Africa must use chemical fertilizers to supplement nutrients from manure biomass for adequate crop production. So is there a better approach to future food production and security? I think there is. Rather than the ongoing divergence between agroecology and modern agriculture, what we need is a more pragmatic approach. We need to use all relevant agricultural practices wisely to produce more food in an environmentally responsible manner. And in order to do this effectively, there needs to be greater advocacy of appropriate technologies both by scientists and policymakers. Now, scientists are very good at doing research and publishing in quality journals, but they need to provide more advocacy of their findings in order to counter the ill-informed and possibly ill-intended calls for agroecology to replace modern agriculture for future crop production in Africa. Can we integrate the best technologies? I think we can. I think it's quite possible that we can because they're well suited to integration. And some examples include intercropping of improved pest and disease resistant and climate adapted varieties, monocultures of GM pest resistant crops with integrated soil fertility and water resources management practices, and in crop livestock systems, forage cover crops, and improved dual-purpose crops. These are just a few opportunities. I know there are many more. So I hope that this has generated sufficient thought for the discussion panel, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Jill. I don't know if we can afford one question. I will ask the committee maybe at the end of the panel. Yeah. Now we will start our first panel. And I will invite on stage the moderator of the panel, Professor Rachid Serraj, also Professor Ken Giller, Professor Johan Six, who is a full professor of sustainable agroecosystems, whose work focuses on the relationship between agrosystem management, biochemical cycling, and food system functioning. Also, Bruno Gerard to join us on stage. And I will not forget our scientist, senior scientist and specialist of soils, Professor Rachid Musdaq. Thank you so much. I will keep my seat. Yeah. Yeah, why not? Please go. Thank you so much. So, Professor Serraj, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Manal. Is this audible? Can you hear? Okay,
yeah,
great.
Fine.
I think a lot has been said between Ken's presentation and Gilles Lenné's great synthetic presentation. I think they will stay in the annals of UM6P, I hope. The nice thing is this is all recorded, so guys, watch out what you're saying. No, I was just joking. To start this conversation, I think obviously you can see the audience is pretty large. Agroecology is a hot topic. It doesn't interest only scientists, by the way. You could see that there's a lot of interest from everyone, basically, society. And that's exactly what we wanted. We want a societal debate. So to kickstart this conversation, I would start with where Jill has left it. So Jill tells us basically that her conclusion, then, rather than the ongoing divergence between agroecology and modern agriculture, a more pragmatic approach is needed to use all relevant agricultural practices. Fouad Larwi will like that, because actually the question becomes, is there a possibility for convergence? So maybe we're preempting the next Science Week. If we hear well the last word from Jill, based on all the synthetic analysis of all those papers and the science, is that actually maybe this is just a battle of words. And also, as Ken has put it, it doesn't really matter how we define, as much as we agree on what needs to be done. So that's my first question to the panelists. And I will start from my left side, Sir Rachid. Is there a possibility for convergence? And your comment on the conclusion from Jill, very quickly, if you could do it in 1 minute or two, please, just to get started.
Okay. Thank you for organizers to invite me to this interesting panel. Yes, I think there is a possibility to converge, but from each other. Not only one stayed in place and other taken, no. We have to understand that each of us don't have the truth. The reality is somewhere. And we need to be clever enough to use our science knowledge to what you call it collaborative, connective knowledge should be there to find solution to this complex situation of agriculture in Africa, Morocco, in the world. And I think that's maybe the main message from me.
No, in 1 or 2 minutes, is there a possibility for convergence based on the conclusion from Jill's presentation that actually the debate should not just be about this polarization of words, but can we take the best practices and try to find what is best for Africa and convergence? Yeah.
One word.
Yeah, we'll come back to you.
Well, I believe in that because I'm an optimist, but I've worked with dogmatic people. I was in Hillary. Jill was my director of research when I was at ICRISAT, so I'm always glad to see back Jill, either on screen or live. Sorry, Rashid, I'm digressing, but I was working at Hillary on biomass trade-off, and I joined CIMIT at that time, and the program was called the Global Conservation Agriculture Program. And as I work on biomass trade-off, I was explaining to people that it didn't work everywhere and the context mattered. And I started directing very dogmatic people. And after 10 years, we did converge. We continued to work on conservation agriculture, but we renamed the program to sustainable intensification because I think it was just one of the approach. And I'm like Jill, I'm very pragmatic, and I'm not, I'm agnostic, and I believe in science.
Should we ask King Giller again? I think he's done a bit of talking about that, so maybe have Johan 6. And I don't know if we have presented Johan. Johan comes, have we presented him?
It was like
He comes to us from UTH Zurich. For those who don't know UTH Zurich, that's the place where Einstein was before moving to the US. So no pressure at all, Johan. He's also one of the most cited scientists in this field that we're talking about. Soil fertility, integrated soil fertility management, soil carbon modeling and all that. So Johan, what's your take on all this debate? Is there a possibility for convergence?
It's working, sorry. So I would say if I'm optimistic as Bruno is, then I don't think we have a choice then to converge. Given how the world is going at this moment, it's going more and more polarized. I'm not sure if that wish is going to come true, but at least I think we should fight for it and try to get to that convergence because I think there is no choice. I mean, I've lectured many times about how I don't believe in the black and white conversations that are going on about agriculture. I don't believe in a black and white agriculture, but I do believe in a colorful agriculture. And I really mean it, it has to be colorful. And it's like Bruno said, is that also if you look around the world and you want to have a sustainable agriculture, the context matters very much. Also, if we look around the world, the challenges are very complex. And so if you want to tackle both of those things, then there is no choice than trying, working with different methods, depending on the context, depending on what the real issue is, that we have to employ all these different technologies. And that's where I sometimes also think that, well, and I've actually done it myself, debates about organic versus conventional, I do not participate anymore. Because I think we're really past that time. We all know what the advantages are of conventional. We all know what the advantages are of organic. Is it then agroecology? Is it regenerative? These are all names. And in many ways, I actually do not want to participate. But I'm here today.
Great conclusion about that's in the past. So Ken, 30 seconds if you could.
Well, less than 30 seconds. I mean, we have convergence in the panel already. The only thing I'd say, though, is that if we're thinking about science and the role of science, too much convergence would worry me. I mean, I think we need different opinions. We need debate. And if we all agree on everything, we've nothing to talk about anymore. So, I mean, there is a level at which we need people to be pulling in different directions, and having people sometimes with extreme views can really help to pull us into thinking differently. So convergence, but not too much, I'd say.
Thank you. Well, actually, I must probably say that unfortunately we couldn't get all the speakers we invited initially. At some stage we were thinking about even a more broader perspective in terms of opinions. And unfortunately, Professor Hackman, who is supposed to be with us also from South Africa to talk about transdisciplinarity, is not here. Hopefully that will be done in the future. Now let's dig a little bit further after this first round. I would like to start with Professor Rashid Musaddaq. For knowledge, Sir Rashid has been working sometimes behind the scene, sometimes in the front of the scene, on promoting conservation agriculture, zero tillage or minimum tillage in Morocco. And so the question to you, Sir Rashid, is sometimes conservation, as we saw also in the presentation, is presented as a part of that agroecology package. So I would like to have your insights on what has been the experience so far, because especially as we're hearing now, Morocco is moving in a big way. We've heard about the strategy for 1 million hectares on direct seeding. So what's the take-home message so far? And what are the constraints of adoption in Morocco?
Thank you, Rashid. That's give me also the possibility to answer some and to see some thought about some first question about conversion or diversion. In fact, for us, by training, I'm soil scientist. So when I come to this conservation agriculture as soil scientist, because working on this agriculture, conventional agriculture, years and years, we noted that there is a lot of problem for soils, mainly erosion. Soil erosion is one of the big threats that we have, not only Morocco, Africa, in the world. So physical parameters are very important. We forget about them. We focus mainly on nutrition, fertility, and crops. So we observe that our soils, in terms of physical, start to be really in bad situation. You know the numbers. If I show the numbers, when I present this, and we measure it, it's not just something that we heard. No, we spent months and months on the field to measure, and we publish this. Very dramatic. And we observe, for example, that we lost around 1,000 to 5,000 tons by hectare by year in some places. Some place it's around 1,500. It depends. If you are in the reef area, if you are in the plateau area, and so on. But we noted that our way of doing agriculture really is damaged these non-renewable resources, because we understand that soil, just 5-10 centimeters, need thousands of years to be developed. That's why when King asking who is showing the movie about kissing the ground, I was the one who see it, and I like it. Why? Because they highlight that the soil resources is ignored in the equation of agriculture. In conventional agriculture, crop is the main important thing. I'm working with CGR since years, and I work with breeders, and I ask them, guys, are you taking consider soil? Say, no, soil for us is the place we put our foot between trial and trial. Soil for them is something ignored in the equation. So from that, we start looking what is available. So years after years, Morocco started this direct seeding in Sattat region since 1918, and there is one big scientist, his name is Bouza, who present this technology in Sattat region, coming from the US, and he tested, and it worked. And he do wonderful trials with space plots and things, and published this, but no one heard about it. Years and years, other research come, Mrabat, others working on this, but no one take this on the stage. So for us, when it's come the possibility to understand, and thanks to Bruno, by the way, I met Bruno in this, and he remember in my visit to CIMIT, a word about impact. And I understand what we are doing as science. If there is no impact, who will do it? So from that, we take decision to propose a roadmap to the Moroccan government to scale the technology based on 14 years of research with data, with everything was documented that way. And let's come to another comment that you say, King. We don't have to make simple communication decision makers. I'm not fully agree with you on that. and they give you our story. And we lost 10 years because of this miss of communication. I remember by this time I was head of department in Iran, and we present the first roadmap to the Minister of Agriculture with scientists. And in this time, some scientists come say, yes, it's work, but you know, the technology need this and that. You know what this minister say? Guys, you are divergents. Go, take your time, and come back to us. We lost 10 years of this. Next phase, when we get the possibility to meet again the same Minister of Agriculture, but he's another position, Prime Minister, we did it in simple way. Technology, increase yield on that, reduce cost of 60%, and also in drought year, we can get at least 2-3 tons by hectare, which is not shame. We don't have to be shame if we can talk about 2 tons, 3 tons in our conditions in Morocco, because we are facing 5-6 years of drought. Fortunately, we have this technology that we share with these farmers. We observe that organic carbon increase. By the way, organic carbon is not a complaint.
To that. That's the next
question. But just to say that after that, we're given this evidence, we get the support from policy, and now they are supporting the technology to move, and we at least have some promising result coming years.
Great. Thank you, Sir Rashid. Now let me turn to my right side. Johan, you have done substantial work on what we call in the jargon agronomist ISFM, integrated soil fertility management, studying feedbacks between agroecosystem management options, biogeochemical cycling, food system functioning, and global change, and so on and so forth, around the world. I think you worked in different continents. So my question is, where do you see the opportunity for best practice adoption of boosting ag productivity today and in the future in Africa? In few words, if you could. 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you. I mean, obviously, well, the first thing I would like to say is I don't like to talk about Africa as one entity, because it's clear that in Africa we have very different contexts. Is it from an environmental standpoint, but also from a human standpoint? And I think this is where we also have to really think about more is we are talking about agriculture, but there are humans involved in agriculture, especially on the African continent. And so what humans are thinking and believing does actually matter. And so in that sense, I would just like to go a bit around to different places and point out where I do think, you know, there's maybe some potential. I mean, the first one is to Rashid, you know, about conservation agriculture. I think when we did some, you know, even global analyses, I mean, we could see that with conservation agriculture, if you go to drier places, very sandy soils, that you can effectively, with these 3 principles, have a bit of an increase in yield. You know, it's, let's say, 10, 20%, not more than that probably, depending where you are exactly. But, you know, if you happen to be like in Morocco or you are in southern Zimbabwe, it can be an option. The problem is obviously where is the residue going to come from? But still, I would not just shoot it, you know, and say that it's not an option because it doesn't work in other places. So I do think indeed that conservation agriculture under the right conditions, in the right place, that it can help. There's also, you know, there's some people that well, or at least you hear quite often, agroforestry versus no agroforestry is another one. And there I would like to point out, you know, an example of when you're in the highlands along the Rift Valley, you know, you are probably involved in some way in coffee production. And then we do know that some form of shade for that coffee is crucial. Quite often, if you're in Uganda, you're going to try it with bananas. And if you have these bananas, then we do know that compost is of importance. So yes, I do not think that compost is everywhere going to help. But in that particular system, where you try to have a banana shading your coffee, that compost is going to play a big role. And we have to have it. So it's again, it's showing, you know, on how, depending on what context you are, where you are, you need these different technologies. If we're now in West Africa, and actually also up here, and I was very happy to hear from Jill, you know, putting an emphasis on water. I mean, and then we have to start thinking about alternatives of how to manage that water. There is the half-moon technique, there is the Zai technique. You know, they have shown to conserve some water. Most likely, if you actually have some form of manure, if you have some form of compost. So it's again about integrating different technologies together, depending on where you are, that can work or not work. We've done quite some work on ISFM, indeed, you know, and mostly in East Africa. I do think it has potential. The issue there is, you know, where are these organic materials going to come from? If we're in Kenya, we're closer, you know, in the western part or in central. We have livestock. There is zero grazing that is happening. So then that manure is a good organic source, but still, you're not going to be able to do it with only that organic material. So you will need some chemical fertilizer. But we've also shown in some long-term experiments that if you do only chemical fertilizer for 20 years in a row, that you start having problems with micronutrients, and so it's actually that manure that is needed. So again, it's a combination of technologies that is going to make it that we can have an increased productivity. And it depends on where you are. Because if you don't have livestock, I mean, then ISFM is probably already going to be more difficult. I mean, then you have to start thinking about Titonia or other organic resources. We've also shown that Titonia can do something, but Titonia is not going to be available everywhere. So it all depends on what situation you have, and you choose between the repertoire of techniques out there, technologies out there, and you can make, I'm convinced, increase that productivity of agriculture.
Thank you, Johan. This is, I mean, we all realize that, you know, in the rooms, when you talk to agronomists in general, we all end up with something called it depends. So we are, and I think the students who have been following the master class with Ken this week got that message already. Now I must change the question. I prepared a question to Ken Giller about regenerative ag, but then he gave us a brilliant keynote this morning. So I'm going to shift. And actually, for the story, I know Ken since I did my PhD in 1987. I was counting today, time is flying, that's 38 years ago, on biological nitrogen fixation in soybean, and that's where I heard about this man. And since then, I've been following his track, and we worked on conservation ag together. So I must say that I get of trouble to find a relevant question, but here is one to you, Ken. In your talk about regenerative ag, one of the things, your battle, for instance, with Corteva, is all this debate about soil, microbial diversity, and how it might affect the system. Both of us have worked on nitrogen fixation, the symbiotic, the rhizobium, but we also, when people claim that it can also work on cereals, you bring azospirillum, sometimes we call it PGPR, sometimes we call it other names. I was at Erie, for instance, with Erie spent about a decade, I don't know, many millions of dollars, try to make the rice fix nitrogen. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. But my question to you, Ken, we are thinking about shaping the future, and we don't want to throw the baby with the water bath, as they say. There is still relevance of research on the soil, microbial artifacts. So where is the frontier there for science looking in the future? Oh my God. I'm trying to make it difficult for you.
Yeah, it's an easy question. I absolutely, we should not throw out the opportunities of innovation, but what I'm arguing for, I started out after my PhD in 1982, working in soil microbiology at Rothamsted. And I was there for 5 years, working in India, ICRISAT, and then measuring nitrogen fixation associated with the roots of cereals using 15N2 gas and things. That was my first baptism into that world. And I switched very quickly to move work with legumes because I could really see the potential. My point is that one of the issues around work on the soil microbiota is often run by microbiologists. I've got a lot of respect for microbiologists, but what we tend to do is we look at what happens on a Petri dish, maybe on a root in a test tube, and then we extrapolate to the world, and we forget about things like competition in soil, that if you put in an inoculant, it usually disappears. You can't find it back a week later. Yeah. And when we see some of the claims being made, you know, there are claims on the internet, many of these products that they, either through the root or through the stomata, they get into the plant, they colonize the whole plant, they're inside every cell. But plants evolved mechanisms to actually exclude microorganisms because they're usually pathogenic. So it's actually very, very difficult for plants to get inside. And even all of the work on endophytes, I mean, one of the authors of our paper is a guy called Ewan James, who I think is one of the global experts on endophytes. Actually, the numbers of bacteria you find inside a plant are very small. So, yes, the microbiota is important. We need to look after soil health, but my understanding is the best way to do that is to manage the organic matter well in terms of quality and quantity, and the microbiota responds to that. Yeah? So I don't see, to be honest, opportunities for manipulating the microbiota directly, apart from keystone functions, and we're talking there about mycorrhizas, nitrogen fixation with legumes. I think otherwise, if you want a healthy soil and a healthy microbiome, you feed the soil with good quality organic matter that can be decomposed, and that actually gives you the function. Yeah? I mean, we could go into this for a long time. I don't see the promise that's out there on biostimulants and manipulation. It's a lot of snake oil being sold on the market at the moment. I think farmers are being fooled with pseudoscience too much. And scientists are playing a role in this. And I think we really need to claw back and be much more rigorous in the science that we're doing.
Great. We might need to follow on this later on. Maybe we need, at some stage, a whole workshop on soil microbial organisms. But let me turn the question now to my colleague, Bruno Gerard. So, Bruno, related to all this discussion, we are at UM6P, which is kind of a baby in all this race. And the UM6P strategy for agriculture, water, climate has one of central pillars, sustainable intensification of African agriculture. What does that mean, actually, for the broad public? And how distinct is that from things like agroecology, regenerative ag, and all those buzzwords? Where do you put the limit, basically, in definition?
Yeah, I could talk 30 minutes about that.
No, not 30 minutes.
No, I will not. And my experience with CIMMYT. Well, I started my career in a very difficult environment. I was working for Ecrisat in Niger, then semi-arid tropics, droughts, sandy soils, poor soils. I could see the big impact of soil fertility management on crop production, on risk reduction as well, sometimes on risk increase, because if you don't pay attention investing in external inputs, you put farmers at risk. I also, like, Joan put it, the human dimension, the diversity of agroecologies, of cultures, of, populations we have across Africa. We're talking of a full continent. So the context matters, and I think it depends of the context should be the right answer we give, not just it depends, because sometimes it depends. It depends on the context and the biophysical and socioeconomic context. So it means a lot for the college. At least I'm trying to bring some of my experience. I did struggle on dogmatic vision of things when I was in CIMMYT. And we did converge at the end. I see some divergence here with Rashid, because we are talking about conservation, agriculture, and reduce or no tillage for the same thing. But it's totally different. And again, reduce tillage without crop residue cover can be dramatic in terms of erosion, and that's your 2009 paper, Ken. So what are we doing in the arid environment where we don't produce enough biomass? Where do we target conservation agriculture or reduced tillage? We probably need to look at, targeting soils with good infiltration rates that are not crusting, because if you don't put crop residue, you'll just get the erosion, and you get gully erosion, and get everything. We need to look at, soils where, in fact, not too much on the slope. That's another criteria. So you can have a multi-criteria analysis when you look at things. So when we say depends, I spent 10 years in CIMMYT working with people engaged in multi-criteria analysis and trying to compare sometimes pears and bananas, which is not easy, but needs to be done. And there are systemic approaches to do it. You need to integrate biophysical and socioeconomic component of your systems and market when you want to try to find solutions and develop solutions. We don't want just to write paper. We want to have impact, but we don't have to have negative impact. We want to have positive impact, or at least a neutral impact, And it's complicated, it's complex, but I think it's doable. I was mentioning, at the welcome speech, the governance. We are not always working in environments that are, in Africa that, are inviting to development, to progress. We talked about, adjustment plans in Africa by the World Bank. I think they were detrimental because they did damage a bit in terms of potential of production. So all those things we want to teach it, do research for the college. We are just a baby. We are not yet there. I think we have very good building bricks in what we are doing, but the challenge is to articulate things in a meaningful manner. And again, starting from the problem and articulate the solution. We do that in research. We want to do that in education as well. I think we have the chance to design today a 5-year degree that will start in September 2025. And we borrow that to Wageningen. We want to build T-shapes of students. And T-shapes is, good disciplinary knowledge, but the ability to connect. And I think it is very important in what we do. So I will not be much longer than that, Rashid.
Thank you, Bruno. You might notice that this panel is kind of biased. Unfortunately, there are no ladies among us. We tried. Our colleague, Joan, I'll come to jail. Joan was supposed to be with us. Pauline Chivenje was also invited to be with us. We were talking also about Africa, so we are part of Africa, but we need... This afternoon, by the way, don't forget, we have another panel on agritech where we have colleagues from Africa and IFAO to explain also the rationale. But let me go back to Jill. I don't know if we have presented Jill, but Jill has been there for a long time. At least I know her since the early 2000s. She's actually the one who hired me to ICRISAT when I was a young scientist. And she has been doing outstanding work across institutions and advising high level, but she also kind of a devil advocate sometimes in science. And that's why we see here today with this great presentation she gave us. So Jill, what's your take on what you've heard so far from this panel? Quickly.
Well, thank you, Rashid, for that glowing description of my inputs. I'm afraid it's not as good as what you've said, but I am continuing to contribute. It's been a very interesting and useful discussion. I'm not a soil scientist, so I have an inability to comment on a lot of the details, but I'd like to raise 2 points. One, it relates to integrating technologies and then considering convergence. Whatever is done will require trade-offs. And as it has been raised by a number of the panelists, when there's not enough biomass, when there's not enough manure, then obviously it will be necessary to integrate chemicals, particularly as was raised in the dry areas of Africa. So it's an issue of the right technologies in the right places. The other point I'd like to make, which hasn't been raised, is the issue of labour productivity. new technologies for improving agroecosystems, especially soils, tend to be labour intensive. And as we know, there's a huge gap between labour productivity in the global south and the global north. And unless this is remedied, that is, we need technologies that do reduce the labour requirements, or farmers will continue to live in poverty. And they'll make decisions to leave farming. And this will contribute to greater dependence on imported food. So I'd like to throw labour productivity into the mix, because I think in terms of soil technologies, it is a really key issue.
Great, thank you, Jill. Let's move on and dig in a little further. Johan, according to Ken's paper on regenerative ag, here's what he says. He says, interest in regenerative agriculture is partly driven by the promise that sequestration of carbon in soil can help to mitigate climate change. So being one of the world experts, I would say, of soil carbon cycling, what's your take on this? What is it, how solid is this assumption, especially in the context, I'm sorry again to put it to Africa as a whole, but you pick up your regions or whatever. How solid is this assumption that carbon sequestration would help us in fighting climate change?
I mean, it's like Ken was saying, is that if we want to have the microbes there, we need soil organic matter. And soil organic matter happens to have quite some carbon in it. So in some ways, we have no choice than to sequester some carbon in our soils. And I think indeed, you know, there are techniques to do it. They are mentioned under regenerative agriculture. They are mentioned under climate smart agriculture. They are mentioned under ISFM. They are mentioned under all of these buzzwords. It's mentioned that soil organic carbon needs to increase. And there are these techniques, and actually if you go across all of these buzzwords, where in practice, we're actually always talking about the same practices. If it's regenerative agriculture, there is talk about conservation agriculture. If it's climate smart agriculture, there's talk about conservation. If we're talking about agroecology, it's again conservation agriculture. And I can do the same for ISFM, I can do the same for manure addition. You know, all of these practices all stay the same, independent from these buzzwords. So this is not only then a critique to regenerative agriculture, but actually to all of them. Because I do think indeed that it has, as Ken pointed out this morning, hugely exaggerated of how much carbon we can sequester. And especially in the African context, because we have less biomass in many places. And we happen to have a lot of sandy soils in Africa, where the potential for sequestration is obviously much less. So when indeed somebody says 10 tons, that in your article there, 10 tons per hectare that can be per year per hectare. I mean, these are numbers, simple calculation, you know, most of it, actually from any material you add, about 10% is going to be sequestered. That's pretty much across the world. So that means 100 tons of carbon per hectare per year that you would have to add in order to get this 10 tons. So these are numbers that are ludicrous. The 4 per mil program is the same. I think the program has a purpose. It was a PR stunt, which I think was good, but nobody can believe that 4 per mil, you know, and that it's going to keep going. So I think this is where we have to be realistic, and looking across all of the different experiments and with different management practices to sequester carbon, when I see numbers of about 0.2 to maybe 0.5 tons per hectare per year, then I believe it, or I can maybe believe it. But anything above that, I have my doubt, and I start being skeptical, and I'll do some calculations then, and probably fairly quickly, I can figure out where they have been made. So this, and then on top of that, I mean, it's 0.2 to maybe 0.5 tons of carbon per hectare per year. And then in all reality, that's probably under African conditions going to be maximum for 10 years that you can keep it sequestered. And then you will hit new equilibrium, and then the game is over.
Thanks, Johan. Let me turn to my left side now. See, Rashid, Musaddaq, talking about carbon again, I'd like to keep this conversation a bit carbon because it's one of the points that links this conversation. So conservation ag or direct seeding, whatever we call it, is often claimed, sometimes claimed, to help build carbon stocks in the soil as a way towards sustainability. Is this achievable in the context of Moroccan agriculture, that's where in Morocco, and how to resolve these biomass residues that Bruno was talking about, trade-offs that Bruno was talking about? How do we get by around that carbon and residue trade-offs?
Yeah, thank you, Rashid. I think we have just to understand that we are adopting this 1 million hectare initiative for next decade, to achieve it by 2013. But we are understanding well that sequestering carbon is the ultimate goal. We are just starting, we are in transition. There is different pillars that need to be implemented before achieving this goal. It's like a baby who starts now, and he can sequester carbon when he gets his bachelor. 10 years, we can talk about carbon sequestration. It's a decade phenomena, it's a yearly phenomena, which means that we know that first, the study that we did, because we have baseline. With OCP, Ministry of Agriculture, we did a wonderful work decade before, 14,000 samples collected, whole agriculture area, analyzed, and we observed that more than 70% of the samples have below 2% of organic matter. That's why we have this huge amount of erosion and things, because of this deep tillage that we used and the monocropping. You know, 80% of our cereal are monocropping, no rotation, no residue on the ground. So we have this spiral degradation that we have years and years. That's why we observe that what we test in our experimental station, when you take the same germoplasm in our neighbor, the yield was reduced by more than 60% because of issues of the management. So we believe, and we agree with a colleague, that 4 per meal or 4 per meal was, you know, maybe we can say fake, but something that some scientists don't believe. And we have debate, by the way, here in Morocco with this French delegation, I remember, during the Marrakesh COP. And it was really a big debate like this one. And we come by the end, one conclusion. Okay, keep the number, but at least each region have to increase this organic matter, 1 per meal, 2 per meal, something. Because what we have in the opposite is the decrease of organic matter, which have the, that's why we support 4 per meal. It's not for the number, it's for the intuition and the initiative. For Morocco, yes, fortunately, you know, by the way, what we can grow under 3,300 millimeters, Rashid. We don't have a lot of diversification. That's why when you talk about trade-off and you want to do diversification, you have very short list of crops that can help you to do that and to, you know, to feed animals, to feed a human with 300 millimeters flow. But what is important here is that's why Morocco is a hub. And we are keen that we have UM6P, a good ecosystem, INRA, other partners here, CGR. All of us need to try to demystify and to find solutions under these really harsh conditions. And fortunately, we have some solutions. Now, when you said about carbon, yes, we prove that carbon, by the way, we have a long-term trial, 20 years here still in Morocco as one of the long-term trials to follow organic matter. And we observe that if you make a good rotation, maybe through residue and, you know, because I say monocropping 80%, if you introduce food legumes, you have this, because we need nitrogen for sequestering carbon also. That's also connected, that's also, and we never say that in our conservation agriculture, no inorganic fertilizer. No, it wasn't never saying like this, and we never say no pesticide. We know that we need to put optimal weed control. That's why we need precision agriculture there, and that's why we are working with farmers to this, to propose things. And we have numbers. We have something around 0.5 ton by hectare by year that we can sequester, which is about after some years. It's not done during first or 3 or 4 years. We need some years, 7 years, 8 years to observe if we adopt this kind of 3 pillars. And fortunately, this kind of data help us to now, for example, World Bank is coming to support the 1 million hectare initiative in Morocco and others. By the way, we have also the initiative Torba, which is an interesting initiative for carbon credit to those farmers. You know, they are very fragile population doing cereal in Morocco, in dry land, if you see. So any technology that can help those to continue doing cereal-based system with rotation, proposing some, you know, food legumes with short, that makes some complexity, but we need to work integrally to, with the pluridisciplinary approach to answer these questions. But again, let's give them some hope. Let's give them, say that they can sequester. Why? They can sequester because soil have poor quantity of organic matter. We need just to increase this. We are not going to increase and say we will have 2 ton trees. We just increase to give the, can I say, the rational ratio of this organic matter on the soils. That's my message here.
Thank you, Rashid. Ken, we're getting towards the end, trying to wrap. So you, and by the way, Ken Giller has been with us here this week. We made, I think, the best use of his time. I think we can justify the carbon offered for his trip. He had given a lecture on the opening, another one in the morning, and meanwhile he's been with students in a master class, so that's huge. And what's really, not to throw flowers, but what's admirable about Ken is thinking, right? Thinking and acting, but that's also based on field. It all came from the fields in Zimbabwe and Malawi and Kenya. Now, my question to you, the last one, Ken, given this place where we are and the ambitions we have in Africa and Morocco, where do you see the frontier of science? Researchable questions, if you could. We obviously need to help promote agricultural productivity, food security in the continent. If we pick up a few, 3, 4 key frontier science questions, what those would be?
That's an easy question.
Again, I mean, everything is easy for this man.
If I could just first play Happy Families, because I met Jill first. It was in either 1983 or 1984, so it's more than 40 years. So a real pleasure to be on the same panel as you now, Jill, from when we were sitting next to the swimming pool in Siat in Colombia.
In Siat.
And with Joe, we have a great paper with Pauline Chavinge, actually, looking at the effect of texture on soil carbon sequestration, which was about 2006 or something, I think. But I mean, yeah, and really important. So soil carbon sequestration depends on the amount of carbon you're putting in, more than anything. So that's the driver, yeah? And we just can't forget that you can't sequester something if you don't put it in. So the real key is, where's that organic matter coming from? But to go to your question, the easy answer is, if we want to address the problems of Africa, we have to understand Africa as this hugely diverse continent of cultures and agroecologies and everything. And the way to do that is to use the tools of systems analysis to start by analyzing the problems at different levels, right from the top to the bottom, in a differentiated way, And in doing so, looking at where are the key entry points and the key trade-offs that we're going to face. And I think the initiatives, and hats off, Bruno, for your pushing and pushing and pushing to this, to set up a center for systems analysis here in Morocco, which could become a leading center. Because then what will emerge from that are all of the different entry points and all of the different pain points that we need to address. So it's not, I'm not going to say, oh, we need this technology, we need that silver bullet. Never. We need to look at that huge diversity. And from that will emerge those sweet spots where conservation agriculture will be the answer, and the general points where legumes will fit into systems, because they fit everywhere, just about. Different types of legumes. But it's really taking that systems analytical view to unpack the problem. And I think you've made the start, you're heading in that direction, and I'd love to be part of the journey together with you.
Thank you very much, Ken. I'm sure Bruno will love this. He's happy, he's smiling. So, Bruno, I know that the College of Agriculture is working on some of these ideas, the idea of systems analysis. You've been pushing for that since you arrived. So I guess this is all very good music to your ears. But my question to you is, is the College of Agriculture at UM6P well set to address some of these questions and challenges, or do we need more? What do we need to get there?
I'll make a few comments before answering that specific question. Thank you, Ken, I think, for your offer. We've been discussing a lot with John as well. I think there are many, many African scholars as well really interested in a more systemic approach. Taking of, membership with ARUA, I think a lot of universities interested in that, and I think that's the future. I want to go back to the carbon because I was a bit upset about the potential of soil carbon for climate change mitigation. A bit like Ken with the biostimulants, because I've been working on biomass most of my career and starting from a place where there was no biomass, and that was a major problem. And in 2014, I just, with David Paulson as co-author, we wrote a paper in Nature, Climate Change and the Limited Potential of Conservation Agriculture. And people didn't like it, but it was database showing that what people dreamt about, getting rich with carbon, soil carbon markets throughout the world was not science-based. And I can still see people building business on that assumption that carbon markets will make farmers rich in Africa and elsewhere. And there's inequity problems and a market problem also on carbon markets. So I think we have to be very careful, and I find sometimes that some of my colleagues are not listening to me. I send them the paper and so on, and you just go back to the same thing. And I think we need to build that because, in CIMMIT, Jan Anderson was work with Ken Giller on contested agronomy was very useful. And scientists didn't like to see him because he was questioning things and he putting the finger where it hurts. But we are not here just to be in a comfort zone and just believe that what we do is the most important things in the world. We are here for self-criticism as individuals and as a group to design the best science to help Africa and the rest of the world. So I think it's very important that. So it's a change of mindset as well. We shouldn't feel aggressed when we, a result is questioned from a systemic perspective. And I think we need to build that culture here. It's more important than how we settle the college, the units, and so on. And I hope the Center for Applied Systems Analysis will also tap on social science and economics because it's very important as well. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Bruno. I think we're coming to an end. Then you could, Jill, you noticed that we, thanks to you, basically, we started from agroecology as a big question, and we ended up with the more, as you call it, pragmatic type of approach, looking at how could we translate this into systemic approach towards ag productivity. So the final word is yours, because, and we also regret that you couldn't be with us. I hope next time you can come and share some of your insights also with the community at UM6P. So your final word on all this, what you've heard from the panelists and this whole session, what's the take-home message?
Well, thank you, Rashid. And I must say, it's most enjoyable to be part of a panel with colleagues I've known for 20 to 40 years. It makes me feel old, but I guess that's the reality. I'd like to focus on one thing, because just this morning, I received a blog from Firebreak, which posted that the Agroecological Fund, which is based in Washington, D.C., it's an organization promoting an extreme form of agroecology, has amassed $100 million from anonymous foundations to fund projects in the global south, to convince farmers to reject modern technologies and return to antiquated agricultural practices. This is a reality. So what does the university needs to do? Obviously, it needs to continue to do quality science, but it needs to tell more people about what it's doing. It needs advocacy. And as Ken said, you need a voice, you need to bolster your legitimacy. And all scientists have a role to play in highlighting the proven scientific technologies, whether they relate to soils or crops or water, because future crop and food production is so important for Africa. And this will involve engaging with environmentalists and activists. I can't see how you can avoid doing that, but it can be done in ways, and I think that's where you need to start. So I want to thank Bruno and Rashid for inviting me to participate in Science 25, and I don't want to leave out Hadja. She's been extremely helpful with developing the presentation and helping me with the technology. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jill. I think that was a good wrap-up message. I don't know if I need to add anything. I think all has been said. Let's start again at 2 and come again, because it's going to be a very exciting session. 2 sessions, actually. The one on agritech. And we have, as I said, the experts from the World Bank, experts from FAO, to talk to us about the digital divide, and also panelists that will discuss all this. And then the final session with students. So come again, and we look forward to another exciting discussion this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much for your patience. It was a disruptive panel for me personally. Yeah, it made me rethink my research questions. Yeah. So thank you so much for that. And this is an invitation to PhD students, to students in general, to stay humble with the results we get at the Petri dish, even within the small plots. So thank you so much, professors, for those insights. And looking forward meeting you at 2, this is right, with another exciting panel that will be led and moderated by Professor Mustafa Bouhsini. And we are looking forward to seeing you at 2. Yeah, thank you so much, professors. Come out.